This is the first of several recordings for the Module 2 PowerPoint on photosynthesis, energy flow, and biogeochemical cycles. So for this video, I will be covering photosynthesis. So this is following along with section 2.4, chapter 2, section 2.4 in your textbook. So your learning objectives for photosynthesis are to describe the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph, identify the inputs and outputs of photosynthesis, and then I would like you to be able to describe 3 reasons that photosynthesis is important to the biosphere. So photosynthesis is a process that occurs in what we call autotrophs. So autotrophs are the producers of all of our ecosystems on Earth. Now, the word auto means self, and troph means like feeding. And so you can consider autotrophs like self-feeding organisms. And they provide food for all other organisms on Earth. So autotrophs make their own food. And by food, I'm generally referring to carbohydrates, glucose, which is a type of sugar. You probably have heard the word glucose before. It's the kind of sugar that you find running in your bloodstream. That's why if you have high blood sugar or low blood sugar, you have like a high level of glucose in your blood or a low level. But glucose originally comes from producers. And so these producers or autotrophs are using sun as energy to make this sugar in the case of photosynthesis, photo meaning light. Now, there's another type of autotroph that produces sugar through chemosynthesis, and that means the breakdown of non-biological molecules or molecules that do not have carbon in them, like sulfur. We are not going to talk about chemosynthesis in very much depth. I just want you to be aware that there are some types of bacteria, organisms like that, around things like hydrothermal vents that can make their own food, even though there is no sunlight present. So, like I mentioned, autotrophs are the producers of all of our ecosystems. That is how we originally get energy in the form of food molecules. Now, heterotrophs are those organisms that need to consume other organisms to get energy in the form of food, glucose, protein, fat, things like that. So whereas autotrophs are plants, some bacteria called cyanobacteria, and algae, which by the way is not a plant. Algae is a different type of organism. Those are our autotrophs. Heterotrophs are animals, a lot of different types of bacteria, fungi like mushrooms, things like that. All of these living organisms need to consume other organisms or like decomposing material from organisms. So the organisms do not have to be alive, but we all consume other organisms in order to live. Like even if we're talking about herbivores, say our cows, they are still consuming plants, which are living organisms. So either a heterotroph consumes a plant or some type of autotroph, or it consumes organisms that consume autotrophs. Now, you only need to know the very basics of photosynthesis. So your learning objective is to identify the inputs and outputs. So photosynthesis, remember photo means light, energy from sunlight. So photosynthesis, as I mentioned, is conducted in plants, some bacteria, and algae. Now, these organisms use energy from the sun. They also use carbon dioxide, which is CO2 from our atmosphere, and water from the soil primarily, to conduct photosynthesis. So these are the inputs: energy from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. And so then during the process of photosynthesis, these things are used to make sugar or glucose. And a byproduct is oxygen. Now, byproduct means that it is primarily released or given off. And that is why we need plants, for instance, in the biosphere or Earth, because plants contribute oxygen to our atmosphere. Now, interestingly, bacteria were the first organisms to begin producing oxygen way back in geologic history. So, cyanobacteria, or we also call it blue-green algae, but it's a bacteria, they developed the ability to metabolize or use energy and to utilize a process that then released oxygen. And oxygen is what allowed for multicellular organisms to evolve. So, multicellular meaning many cells, right? You can have unicellular organisms like bacteria and multicellular organisms. But oxygen can be carried in our bloodstream and taken to different tissues or areas of our body, to our body cells. And so, before the development of oxygen or the release of oxygen into our atmosphere, multicellular life was not really possible. So, it was bacteria that started the evolution of multicellular life because of releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. So again, the inputs into photosynthesis are energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and water. I put from the soil, and that mostly applies to plants, right? If it's algae, they're living in an aquatic environment, so it's not coming from the soil. And the outputs are sugar and oxygen. Now, why is photosynthesis so important for the biosphere? So, first of all, take a second and think about what the term biosphere means. We haven't actually talked about that term yet. So, the biosphere refers to land, water, and the atmosphere, the lower atmosphere. Okay, so it's all the areas where life on Earth occurs. So, the first reason that photosynthesis is important is it creates oxygen, like I just talked about. Most living organisms need oxygen to provide energy for the cells. Now, we need oxygen in order for metabolism, or what we call cellular respiration, to occur. So I'm going to write that down here for you. So your cells cannot use sugar in its normal form for energy like building molecules. Your cells need to use a type of cellular energy called ATP, and they get that from the breakdown of glucose. So your cells need oxygen for cell respiration. And then cellular respiration, which is probably a term you have not heard of before, refers to breaking down food molecules, mostly sugar, and using it to make cellular energy, which is called ATP. I'm going to move this text here. 1 second. There you go. And then ATP is used for cellular actions such as building large molecules like proteins. It's also used for other things, but this is the easiest example to remember. So go ahead and pause the lecture recording here so you can write those things down, but I'm going to go ahead and continue. Now, another reason that we need oxygen is that it is used to create the ozone layer. Now, the ozone layer, so atmospheric oxygen, the stuff you breathe, is two oxygen atoms bonded together. Now, the ozone layer is actually three oxygen molecules bonded together. That's what forms our ozone layer, a lot of those O3 molecules. Now, the ozone layer is necessary to protect the planet, all of the living organisms, from excess UV radiation. Now, you may or may not have heard that the ozone layer, there's a hole in the ozone. Now, it actually has decreased in recent years. I haven't looked at the data in the last couple years, but when there's a hole in the ozone, people who live in the region where the hole exists will be exposed to more UV radiation, so they can experience higher incidence of skin cancer or cataracts, for instance. So the ozone layer is very important to life on Earth. Now, another reason that photosynthesis is necessary is it provides energy for ecosystems. Now, for that, I'm referring to the fact that autotrophs perform photosynthesis. They are the producers for all of our ecosystems, most of our ecosystems. So, by conducting photosynthesis, these autotrophs are making sugar, and we all living organisms depend on this for life. And finally, photosynthesis provides carbon for organic molecules. Now, this is a little more difficult, this concept, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the chemistry here. But in photosynthesis, the carbon from carbon dioxide, which is CO2, that carbon is taken from carbon dioxide and it is used to make sugar. So any molecule with a lot of carbon in it can be used as an energy source. So like our fuel, petroleum and oil, is really a bunch of carbons bonded to hydrogen. So I'm going to write a couple notes here for you. So first of all, remember that a molecule is two or more atoms bonded together. And again, I don't want to get into a lot of chemistry because you don't need it, but when I use the word molecule, that is what I'm referring to. Like water is H2O, two hydrogens and an oxygen. So molecules with molecules with many carbons are used as fuel sources. So photosynthesis Okay, so photosynthesis breaks down that carbon dioxide into individual oxygen atoms and a carbon atom, and those carbon atoms are used to make glucose, which actually each molecule of glucose has 6 carbons in it. So those are the 3 reasons that I need you to know about regarding why photosynthesis is important for the biosphere. And these are covered in your textbook as well. So that is the end of this initial video, and then I will be making videos on energy flow through the ecosystem, and biogeochemical cycles.